It is the 9:30 hour. We're ready to get started. If y'all want to come on in and find yourself a seat. We find ourselves today in Daniel chapter 6. If you've been paying attention, we've been jumping around a little bit, trying to just catch the chronological flow as we go through this, because this is a book that, although it is not an historical book, it's not a history book, it does record historical activity. And so we're going to go through it in that chronological manner, even though it wasn't written that way. It's written to present the things that God is doing and the way that He is intervening and the way that He is utilizing His people in order to affect the affairs of nations, in order to, in many ways, intervene where He does so miraculously, like we're going to see today in Daniel chapter 6. But we've been trying to sort out the history as we go because it's important. And one of the concepts that we find in the book of Daniel is that God presents Himself as the sovereign God. He deals with kings. He deals with empires. And He proves Himself and asserts Himself to be sovereign over those empires and over those kings. And so today we're going to see another instance where this happens. But now what's happening is there's a transition from one empire to the next, almost an overnight transfer of power from the Babylonian Empire to the Medo-Persian Empire. And so we've spent a little bit of time looking at that. But we have covered chapters 7 and 8. And now we've gone back last week to chapter 5. And now we've arrived here at chapter 6. So just kind of recap everybody on that and to catch that flow. We also want to keep in mind that Daniel, an interesting Bible character, he's not getting any younger as the history progresses here. And so, again, there's a little bit of debate. It's not a precise timeline, but if we assume that Daniel was about 17 when he was taken into captivity, when he was taken by the Babylonians from Jerusalem, and he was taken and he was made a eunuch and he was put into service in the king's court as a young man, and he was about 17. If we line up the information that we have as far as the kings, not only of Babylon, but now King Cyrus of Medo-Persia, and we know the historic dates there, Daniel is now in his 80s, perhaps as old as 84. We looked last week and saw that maybe when he was summoned by the king to interpret the handwriting on the wall, that he was in some sort of a modified retirement. He was prominent in the kingdom, but because of his age, he wasn't there in the court, or he wasn't holding an office. But what we're going to see today is he's going to be placed into a very high position once again, even in his advanced age. So there's hope. Life isn't over at 80, and certainly wasn't for Daniel. He was put into a place of prominence. When we left off last week, we saw one of the things that we want to kind of get lined up in our minds, because it's far too easy to make an assumption that is just not in line with the historical timeline. And what it does is it causes critics of the Bible to question the veracity, the historical accuracy that is found in the historical narrative. And it's worthwhile and I think important for us to kind of sort these things out. So we encountered the time when the Medo-Persian army pounced on Babylon, took it over in one night. Belshazzar was the king at that time. He lost his kingdom and his life that night. But we find at the end of chapter 5, it says here that that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius, or Darius the Mede, received the kingdom. Now that can be an assumption there. Okay, we know of King Darius from history. We've heard his name. This is obviously talking about him. And in receiving the kingdom, it sounds like he now became the king here. But in reality, we're given a little piece of information that allows us to better understand what's being said and what's not being said. It says being about 62 years old. So we know the exact date that Babylon fell. It was October the 12th of 539 BC. We know on that date that this guy who was Darius the Mede, which usually is a distinguishing characteristic, King Darius was Persian. There we get a little bit of insight, but we also know that the ages don't add up. And so this guy, the Mede, is actually a gentleman whose name was Ubaru. He was a governor of a province in the Medo-Persian empire, kingdom there. But he was a general at the time of this, and he was the general who, in essence, instead of this telling us he became the king, it tells us that he received the kingdom. He received the surrender. He was the conquering general, the one who overtook Babylon for his king, King Cyrus. So we asked last week, is this King Darius? Because we're going to meet King Darius later on in the book. So it's worth kind of looking at this. But let's just look at it and just see some of the things that we can understand, just because the Bible gives us that detail that he was 60 years old on the night that Babylon fell. All right, Cyrus the Great, who was the king who overtook Babylon. What does the Bible prophesy that Cyrus will do that makes a major impact on Judah?
Restore the temple.
He will restore the temple. What did he do that led to that? He released the captives. He's the one that sent them back to Judah and released them from the exile so that they could even go back. He was called by name by the prophet Isaiah before the exile even took place. And God foretold that this would happen. Matthew.
Do you think that he did that almost like in reparations? Because he financed it too.
Yes, he did. Hold that thought, because at the very end of the lesson we'll address that. And I think it's something that's a very interesting way that God worked in all of this. But hold that thought as to asking the question why and what God was doing in all of that. All right, so Cyrus the Great was the king of the Persian Empire when Babylon was conquered, which means unless there were two kings, which there weren't at that time, that their King Darius was another person. All right, this King Darius, we know from history, we know for a fact that he was born in 550, he died in 486. He was only 11 years old when Babylon was captured. So he's not 62 at this time, he's an 11-year-old boy. He reigned over the Persian Empire until 522, and he died. Interestingly enough, just a kind of a side note, shortly after the Battle of Marathon. What impact has the Battle of Marathon had on the world? Marathon runner. We have a 26-mile race that is the exact distance that a runner ran to announce the outcome of the battle, and he, of course, died, which I think is the greatest reason not to run a marathon, but that's just my personal opinion. But anyway, so that's the historic context of that. But he also was suffering a series of setbacks, and Egypt was revolting in his kingdom at about this time that he died. And so we can pinpoint the time of his death there in 486. All right, fast forward a little bit to Daniel chapter 1, because we have Darius, King Darius, is mentioned again. What was the name that was given to us before? Darius the Mede. All right, so now the Bible, giving us accurate information, is going to identify Darius again in a different way. In the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus. All right, so there's another distinguishing characteristic here between these two guys. Is the Bible is distinguishing between them. Daniel is distinguishing between them. We need to distinguish between them. This is King Darius. He was the son of King Ahasuerus, who was also known as Xerxes, if you've ever heard that name. A very powerful king. He was the king who was defeated at the Battle of Thermopylae. If you remember the history there, where the 300 Spartans defeated the hordes of Persians who were sweeping in and intent on conquering not only Greece, but they were going to conquer all of Europe, so that Xerxes would feel fulfilled as a king and would have all of Europe as part of his domain. But he was sent with his tail tucked between his legs back in defeat because of what the Spartans did there. This king, Xerxes, Ahasuerus, was the king who made Esther his queen after he executed Queen Vashti, if you know that story from the Old Testament. So these are the two people that we're talking about, one of whom is in fact King Darius. In chapter 9, Daniel's going to serve under him, but we also need to keep in mind that it's a different guy from the one who was there to receive that kingdom. All right, so let's go to chapter 6 and look at how this kind of folds over here. Again, we have the demarcation of a chapter there, but it's really a bad break. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. They're going to refer to this guy as king. So that's further confusion here. And this is what leads a lot of people to this misunderstanding of who's being talked about historically here. He is referred to as king. Well, we just kind of need to understand how the flow of things work. This was a huge empire. And an empire consists of a collection of conquered kingdoms. And each kingdom within the empire would have a king over it. Under the Roman Empire, there was a guy in Judah who was a king. What was his name? Herod. Absolutely. Well, how can you have King Herod ruling when there's obviously a Caesar on the throne? Well, it's because of the nature of empires, and certainly back in that day. So he was functioning, it would be in our understanding, as a governor. You would have the president, he's in charge of the entire country, but each of the 50 states has its own governor. So that's essentially what we're looking at here, but the Bible is going to refer to him, rightly so, as king. He was the supreme over that kingdom, with the exception of Cyrus the emperor, the one who would reign over the whole empire. So he's now going to function in that capacity. This has been handed off to him. So here's the administration that's being appointed here with these 120 satraps, these 3 higher officials here, Daniel being one of those 3, that are simply going to help him administer his kingdom, or this kingdom, because he's going to be held to account by Cyrus himself. And so Daniel is one of these guys. He's put over these various satraps who were just regional officials. This is just helping things out. This would, in our terms here, you would have Cyrus would be the president, Darius the Mede would be the governor. You would have Daniel, who would be maybe a lieutenant governor of sorts, and then you would have 120 county officials who manage the counties. But it's just simply a hierarchy of administration so that you can manage a vast area. And it's important because it's a conquered area. They would have to kind of take control of this thing. And so that's all that's being explained to us there. Why is this important that Daniel is one of these guys? Or does it matter? he just kind of fell into, maybe he was a popular guy, got elected. No, there were no elections here. What does this say about Daniel?
He's a smart guy.
He was a very smart guy. He had proven himself from a young age. He had garnered the trust of previous kings. He had a reputation as a man who could get things done. And he also had a reputation, again, in a pantheistic multiplicity of gods. He had a man who had a God. And his God intervened in the lives of these people on numerous occasions. So even those that didn't hold to his God as being the one true God, they respected this man as a man of religion. And they respected his God. His God was, the one that wrote on the wall just a little while back and foreshadowed the fall that night of what was going on. Richard.
Do you not think that these Medo-Persian people did not know about that forecast that Daniel did way back for King Nebuchadnezzar about that beast of head of gold and all like that? And they knew that for that progression in a way that they were represented by the silver part of that statue. So you have God's providence entering in here, and the fact that he's not going to make a lie out of Daniel after Daniel told these people about this progression here, and the future, the history, So he is fulfilling that prophecy, and they're living it right there. They know Nebuchadnezzar was the head, they're going to bear the silver part. So I think that worked in Daniel's favor.
Sure.
And that plus, he was on site that night that they took over, and that he had just prophesied about that takeover.
Right.
So they didn't feel as though he was any kind of threat. If anything, they knew they could look to him for forecasting stuff to come.
Right.
So
God.
they gave him a lot of leverage on the administration.
That's right. God was working with Daniel as he was working in the lives of even the kings of these great empires and that succession of these great empires. All right, so now we have Daniel as one of three who is serving under one who is serving under the emperor. So Daniel is very, very powerful. And so you have these men that are below them. You would imagine that each of them had control over 40 of those 120. We're not told that specifically, but that would make sense as power kind of filtered down to the local level. That would make sense. But at any rate, there was interaction between these 120 men and the 3 men over them, and they took care of business and then simply reported to the king. That put Darius the Mede in an interesting situation here. He was in a position to be manipulated, and he was in this case. He was manipulated badly, and it caused him great consternation, but he was not keeping a tight rein on the people below him, and it came back to bite him. Somebody, if you don't mind, read verses 4 through verse 9 of chapter 6 for us.
Then the high officials and satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, all are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction, that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document, so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of Moses and of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction.
All right, so we have an interesting thing going on here, where they present this newly appointed president or king or governor of this kingdom who is now going to have to not only subdue Babylon, but incorporate it into the larger Medo-Persian Empire. He's got a lot of things going on. He's got to keep things at peace. He's got to make sure that that everything flows up properly to the empire, and he's got conniving men working for him. But now they're going to use a valuable tool that works with a lot of people. What tool do they use to get at this man to rise to me? Flattery. Absolutely. Never, ever works, does it? You guys are a marvelous class, by the way. It works. I promise you it works. All right, so they're going to use this to ensnare Daniel. They are jealous of him. Now, there's an interesting word that's used in verse 7. What is the first word in verse 7? All. All right, so there's a trap being set here. Daniel is a man who is loyal to the government, to the officials that he serves. He's proven himself 100% loyal throughout all of this. And they cannot find anything wrong with him. In fact, we're told before that he is faithful. And that is not referencing God, that's referencing his administration. He is a loyal citizen of this kingdom because that's where God has placed him. And they said that there's nothing we can find against this guy. There's no way to trap this guy unless we trap him in something that has to do with his God. So now they're going to make a law. They're going to approach the king with something that there is no way, no how Daniel would ever consent to. When they said that all have agreed to this, were they telling the king the truth? Nope. They were lying to him. You got to figure that some of these satraps were loyal to Daniel. These men probably knew who, was loyal to who or whatever. So 2 of the regional guys, the commissioners that were there, 2 of the 3 conspired against the 3rd, and they got probably a majority, but certainly not all of the satraps below them. But they came to the king and they said, every single one of us is in favor of this. Well, that'll make a king feel good. Yeah, this sounds great. I mean, this is fabulous that we're going to do this. But they also did something that was kind of interesting. These men, more than likely, were not Medes and Persians brought into the administration. At least a majority of them was like Daniel. They were from there. These were men that knew Babylon. And they knew the way things were and the way that things worked. But they also knew that there was a quirk in the Medo-Persian law that would make something, once the king declares something, there's no getting back off of it. It is a done deal. Once he signs it, once he stamps it with his signet ring, it's irrevocable. And so they knew that all they had to do was get his signature. All they had to do was get him to approve this, and they flattered him, and they got him to do that. But they said, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, we're no longer under the Babylonians. We're under a new law here. And so we recognize, great king, that we are under your law. And so it says that it cannot be changed, and it cannot be revoked. You may remember in Esther, we find in chapter 8 and verse 8, the king, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, had issued a decree that all of the Jews would be wiped out. He could not even revoke that. Even when he realized what had happened, what did he do that solved the problem in Esther? He could not revoke it.
He armed them.
He armed them. He allowed them to defend themselves. And so he could not undo this law, but he simply passed another law that allowed the Jews to take care of his business. That's how strict this law was. Once the king says something, once he puts that signet ring down, it is simply a done deal. It cannot be revoked. And so it's important for us to understand that this was the trap that was set for Daniel. There was no room for compassion. as we're going to see. This was, once they got it, the trap was set. If we look down further, we find this repeating itself so that we get the full impact of this. They came before the king in verse 12 concerning the injunction. O king, did you not sign an injunction? Do you think they knew that? Yeah, they knew that. That anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you shall be cast into the king of lions. And he said, this stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. All right, so we get this, the full impact of this, and it's starting to snowball down. Look in verse 15. Know, O king, it's a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. They knew they had a trap. They sprung it on Daniel, and they were going to get rid of him. It's really a good plan. It really is. It's solid because they can. They've got 2 of the 3 guys there. They can get rid of Daniel. They'll just put another one that they can get along with. They can work with in his place, and then they can control this king. So you've got a foreign king coming in over them. You've got the local boys that are sitting there running this. We're going to help you out. We're going to run this thing for you. Kings come and go, but it's the middle bureaucrats there that run the show. And that's exactly what's happening here. And they were using the laws against him. All right, so this is what is being said. And hopefully we know this story, but just catch the importance of this, of what is happening here and the lengths to which people are going to go to attack a man of God, and the lengths to which God is going to go to in order to see his people through their suffering. And it's an important lesson not only for Daniel, it's in the bigger picture of Judah, but it's certainly in the larger picture of the Lord's church and individual Christians within the Lord's church. To recognize that this same God, the God of Daniel, is your God. And to understand that he controls these things. There is nothing in the New Testament that said that this isn't still the same God. There's nothing in the New Testament that says that he does not still work in the affairs of nations. And he does. We don't necessarily see his hand. The best we can do oftentimes is go, well, perhaps this is what God's doing. But God is still in control. We're told that in Romans. God establishes governments. You submit to them. And that's exactly what Daniel was doing back then. And we find him recognizing a principle. Who shall he obey? Man or God? He's going to come into conflict with this. This is a man, no fault could be found with him. He was faithful in the administration of his office. But now they've set this thing in motion. He's got a choice to make. And here's the point where it becomes important for us to understand this. How long was this decree in effect? Just forget about God for 30 days. Just make it through this thing. Don't get busted. You'll keep your job. You'll keep your position. But that's not what Daniel does. He obeys God rather than men. Even when there was an easy out. This isn't 30 years. There was an easy way out for him. He could have the best of both worlds here. He could compromise. And then just pick back up, apologize to God on the 31st day, and rock on, right? Well, that's not what he does. Somebody read verses 10 through 15 for us.
When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber, open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed, gave thanks before his God, and as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed.
All right. So, the most fascinating thing to me here, not only did it say earlier up in verse 7 that all of these officials agreed to this, when in fact they didn't, but it was made known, this law was published, and Daniel became aware. He knew the document had been signed. He knew that this was now in full effect. And he goes and realizes that 30 days is all he's got to do. So he just keeps his windows shuttered and he prays in his private prayer closet for 30 days. You're shaking your heads. What does he do? Opens his window. Now, this is fascinating to me. The guys that had set him up, what does it say that they did? They went by knowing that this was Daniel's habit. How would you like to be known as a person that is so dedicated to God and so predictable in your devotion to God that they could lay a trap for you like this and then they knew what time to show up to catch you? That's pretty amazing. Daniel was faithful to his God and he wasn't going to change a thing. What does this tell us about what Daniel remembered from everything that God did with Nebuchadnezzar? What do you think is in Daniel's mind? I've got to protect myself? God's in charge here. Nothing had changed. In fact, he knew that even the disruption in empires was all part of God's plan. He knew that this is the second kingdom. He knew that Cyrus was going to rise. This was the ram that he saw. This was the chest of silver that he saw. Everything was unfolding exactly like God had predicted. There was no wavering in Daniel. His trust was in God. He didn't go, oh no, what am I going to do? Because now there's new people. There's a new sheriff in town. That wasn't it at all. You had this man who was devoted to God. He left his windows open. He let the trap be sprung, and everything was fine. Now, what kind of a track record did Darius the Mede have with Daniel up to this point? We don't know. Whatever it was, he appointed Daniel as one of those 3 top guys under him. By reputation? Okay. By recommendation? Probably. But this is not only a new kingdom that has come in here, a new empire that has come in, but this is a man who was serving the God who called Cyrus by name through a different prophet, who said that Babylon was going to fall. There has to be some sort of communication, I think, that Richard was talking about, although we're not told, but some way, somehow, there's a special relationship between Daniel and this king already, because we're told that Darius the Mede is deeply distressed. This isn't just, oops, I shouldn't have done this. It's telling us this guy is really worked up about this. He knows that Daniel is important. Maybe all it was that he was good at his job. Maybe. But there's at least some likelihood that God's hand on him and his ability to interpret dreams and to read handwriting on the wall and to be a voice of God in this empire, in the halls and the courts of kings, some of that may have gotten to this guy's ear and he just didn't want to lose Daniel. It said he labored till the sun went down to rescue Daniel. What was the trap? Why couldn't he do anything about it? That's the law. That's the way their system works. And so he was beholden to it. The king was a victim of his own signature. And his own signature held power over him. And there was literally nothing he could do about it. But he is wanting so desperately to pardon Daniel. And this is curious to us. Because it just, in my mind, it's like, just pardon him. You can do whatever you want to do. Just make a new law. But you remember the way that Xerxes got out of this was he made a different law that allowed them to defend themselves. There was no way he could make a different law that would undo this one. And so he was trapped. This was a well-laid trap. And then as soon as he's trying to rescue this guy, you've got these conspirators that come back in going, this is the law of the Medes and the Persians. And if those guys are Babylonians, which more than likely they were, that's devious. No, we're all about the new guys. We're all about the new empire. We're loyal to the Persian king. And they trapped this guy so that they could kill Daniel. All right, so we have things that are unfolding. All of this plan is coming in. And then we have the encounter here that I think speaks volumes. If you look beginning in verse 16, it said, Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions, and the king declared to Daniel. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I was in a position like this, and it was inevitable, I'm going to go find something else to do while the dude gets mauled by lions. Get a little bit of distance between. I don't want to watch this mess. But he goes and he talks to him, and he says something very curious. May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. Why would he say such a thing as that? What is there that could have possibly impressed him at this point in their relationship that caused him to say that?
He saw the faith of Daniel.
Say that?
He saw the faith of Daniel.
All right, he sees the faith of Daniel.
I was going to say basically the same.
And I think you probably couple that with he's probably at least heard what this guy has done. What this God has done for the previous kings. But again, these are not followers of Yahweh. These are pantheistic heathen pagans. They're idolaters. But we find that, again, you got to think maybe Cyrus had been told that there's a prophet in Judah that said that you're the one that's going to come and do something for these people who are in exile. Maybe when you're going, okay, now tell us what's been going on the last generation or so in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom here. Maybe they talked about what was going on. Matthew?
I was going to say, usually people in that type of authority have a chain of information coming. And it's basically survival.
Yes, absolutely.
So because of that, the accolades of Daniel probably did not go unnoticed in the ear of the king.
That's right.
So to have that as an asset in your kingdom, it would be, I would say, extremely vital, especially linking one kingdom to a next.
Absolutely. For that transition.
So you've got to know this guy knew Daniel, knew of his deeds, knew of his ability to predict dreams, because just that alone had to be legendary.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, he was rooting for him, because without him as an asset, those previous things that were called, why watch that slip through his fingers like sand?
That's right. And it's an important point to make at this juncture. Sometimes God uses your trials for the benefit of another. Sometimes God will use what you're going through and your suffering to have an impact on an unbeliever or even a wavering believer. And that's exactly what's happening here with Daniel. But Daniel wasn't concerned about the lions because he was trusting in God. All right, pick back up there. A stone was brought, laid in the mouth of the den. King sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing could be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace, spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. He is enduring a sleepless night. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in with haste to the den of lions. This was the only thing that mattered to this king on this night. Again, catch the moment that is there and the intensity of this. This was not just some kind of incidental occurrence, a little bump in the road in this man's new administration. This was huge to him. And he was very anxious to find out what's going on. But his confidence, even though he's got a suffering through a sleepless night, it's not, Daniel, I hope you can defend yourself against these hungry lions. It's, may your God intervene here. And now he's going to find out what is going on in this. All right, so pick up in verse 20. As he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" There's a little bit of faith here. Not nearly as much as Daniel, but it's in the right place. He doesn't say, "Daniel, did you survive this? Has your God delivered you? Has your God caused this to happen?" And Daniel said, "O king, live forever." That's what you say to kings. That's what you say to the people that you're over. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." And the king was exceedingly glad. He was happy that this happened. Commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the lion's den. Both of these people give credit to God in bringing Daniel through this problem. I think it's crucial to understanding that, seeing the importance of this. But this is building faith in Darius the Mede. It's confirming faith in Daniel. Once again, God has proven trustworthy. But now this new guy in town gets to see it for himself. Never doubt the influence that your faith can have on someone around you. That if you will stand firm in God, that it may feed that faith of someone around you so that they in turn will deepen their faith. These are just two men. They happen to be in important positions, but they're just two men. And we're seeing how the working of God in the life of one man is having a positive impact in the life of another man. And we can never fail to see that the God who is sovereign over us as well as sovereign over nations. Now, God has a precious sense of irony. God likes to do things like this, and his judgments are kind of interesting. Because what we find happen is the exact same thing that happened with Haman. Maybe there was something about these Persians that enjoyed doing stuff like this. But, Haman built this gallows that he wanted to hang the Jews on, and he himself was hung on this very same gallows. If you got to piece together an electric chair and you found out that you were the one that got strapped into it, that you couldn't miss the irony that you were going to your execution. Well, the same thing happened to these guys when all of this transpired. So the law was fulfilled. Everything about the law of Medes and Persians was lived up to seamlessly, but now it's time to act anew. And the king commanded that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought forth and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. That's a violent end to these men who were conspiring just to get rid of Daniel, and just to get rid of a man that they found a threat to them because he was competent in what he did, and he served a foreign god. And so we're just reminded here that Daniel didn't have to retaliate. This would have been a great moment for Daniel to say, "Okay, king, I made it here. You're amazed at what God did. We need to take care of these guys." He didn't have to say that. God is the one who said, you cannot repay evil for evil. Vengeance is mine. I will repay. And so we find Daniel acting very consistently with what God tells us to do and how God tells us to act. Daniel was in a position of power. He held the king's attention, but he also held an office. And he could have exacted his own revenge here. And we find that that's not necessary because God is a great God. Then we find the same thing that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. When faced with God's actions, we find the same thing happening now to Darius the Mede. God showed his power. God intervened in a circumstance, and a human king responds to that with an amazing statement of faith. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. You can't really do that by law, by the way, but it was nice of him to try. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lion. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So again, we are reminded that King Cyrus is still the big dog. That this is not King Darius the Great that we see later in Persian history, that they just happen to share the same first name. So the history of the Bible is accurate. This statement made by this heathen king is incredibly accurate. He is the God whose kingdom will never be destroyed, whose dominion is forever. That's an amazing concession from this guy. And so we see, using that term loosely, conversion, just like with Nebuchadnezzar. Two kingdoms in a row where God has placed his people in the midst of a foreign nation. Those people and their actions and their faith have had a positive impact on the people as they were strangers and aliens in the midst of them. Precisely what the church is today. Exactly what was going on. Now back to Matthew's question before we finish up. God uses 3 successive empires to punish Israel, the Israelites. They're divided into northern and southern kingdom, and they're going to be treated differently, and they're going to be overcome differently. But it's interesting that the kingdoms that he uses behave differently as they conquer. And you can see God's hand at work in this sequence of events as well. Assyria, they would come in there and they would devastate a people, and then they would take the best and they would disperse them throughout the other conquered territories of their empire and leave only the dregs behind. And then they would take people from other conquered lands and move them in to interbreed. What was left after the Assyrians did this was the people, the Samaritans, who were considered by Jews to be half-breeds. You know why they were considered to be half-breeds? Because they were. That's exactly what had happened. So God destroyed the 10 tribes there. They were now dispersed because their genealogy mattered no more. The only thing that would matter about these people was how they responded to Jesus Christ. That's all. Their heritage would not play a role. Then he raised up Nebuchadnezzar. He raised up the Chaldeans, who would come and judge the southern kingdom. These guys had a very peculiar way of doing things. And when they conquered, they took the people and they brought them to Babylon. They brought the best into their own empire to make their own empire better. And they brought their gods with them and placed them into the temple of their God, because they believed that that made their God stronger and that made their kingdom stronger. And so now you have Judah brought into exile as a whole, and all of the furnishings of that temple. And then God raises up Cyrus. Cyrus had a different way of doing things. And it wasn't that he was just simply a good king that just did this one favor for God. But God raised up and God utilized the nation, and he had a different philosophy in conquering. And he saw the benefit to leaving people in place in a conquered land to prosper in that place under his reign. And so now he comes into Babylon. He sees a people who are in exile. And he sends them back home. And yes, he did this at the behest of God. Yes, God said, I'm going to use him to do this. But this is what he did with all of his people. Everyone that he conquered, as he conquered a new place, he wanted them to flourish as a people where they were. And again, it just shows God's hand at work in all of these things. And we find Cyrus obeying God, but we also find God utilizing these nations and what they bring to the table. Richard.
Well, this was a part of a miracle of the Lord, and the fact that he fixed it basically, simple answer, or however you want to say it anyway. But he fixed it so that that line of the Christ continued through Judah. We're entering the last 14 generations that's listed in Matthew, the first chapter.
Absolutely.
Back on until the Christ.
That's right.
So he's still under a promise to Abraham here to keep that line intact, okay? And it has not been completed yet. So he is miraculously seeing to it that in these threats, like this command to do away with the Jewish people, you have all these threats, but he's keeping enough power there to keep that lineage intact through that one tribe.
Right.
Because he made a promise to Abraham, and he keeps his promise.
That's right. You know, there were actually 2 tribes and part of the Levites that were in the southern kingdom. Who was, in addition to Judah, who was in that southern kingdom? What other tribe? Benjamin, absolutely. Who's the most prominent Benjaminite in the New Testament? Paul. Saul of Tarsus was a Benjaminite. All right, so God preserved this lineage not because Judah was wonderful, but because that was what he was doing to bring Christ into the world. And all of this was the powerful working of God. Nothing was going to destroy Judah. All right, that's our time for today. Appreciate your kind attention and your contribution to our class, and I look forward to our time of worship.